So one thing that I do love about the UFC is the fact that we're always searching for that new guy, that new dog in the yard, that next huge prospect to put all of our faith in hopes that they eventually can be UFC champion. There's always that new unranked prospect who has a entertaining fighting style or maybe a great personality that we really do invest in hopes that one day they can achieve greatness in the UFC. But sometimes they don't meet that expectation. Sometimes they get fraud checked. But you know what? There's so many fighters on the roster today, and there's so many that get this hype that I think can really get fraud checked in the future. So in this video today, I'm going to talk about 5 UFC fighters who have a ton of hype that might potentially get fraud checked in the future. Now, I don't know this for sure. This is not a foolproof list of fighters who will get fraud checked, but this is my top 5 rankings for fighters who can be fraud checked. And if they do get fraud checked, it's going to be a lot of "I told you so," "this guy was overhyped," or it's going to be fans who were very disappointed and be coping about how this fighter just got fraud checked. So let's get right into it. If these 5 fighters get fraud checked, the UFC will be in shambles from pushing them so hard, or the fan base will have a huge reaction, whether that being negative or positive, maybe even mixed. It will get a huge reaction. Now, starting off with number 5, we have Paddy Pimblett. Now, Paddy Pimblett could have not made this list entirely. The secret is out, man. We kind of know now that Paddy Pimblett is not really all that talented in the UFC. When he fought Jared Gordon, man, the secret came out, bro. This guy is, I think, mid-level, like mid-unranked level at best. So in reality, Paddy Pimblett can't really get fraud checked because we already believe he's a fraud. Again, the secret's out. We know Paddy Pimblett is not really that good, but the UFC is still pushing him. They're giving him favorable matchups. He's only fought guys in the UFC that have given him the best chance of winning. He might fight Dan Hooker next. The UFC is obviously protecting him at all costs because they know that he is a big name. I think pretty much everybody in the UK that follows MMA or UFC knows who Paddy Pimblett is. Again, he does bring attention to the UK market, so they want to protect him at all costs and make sure that he can win fights and get into the rankings so that they can bring him to the UK and have a O2 Arena card there. But let's be real here. If Paddy Pimblett fights anybody that is decent at striking in the UFC, he might just get KO'd. He's one of the few fighters on this list that I can really see getting fraud checked by anybody good. But will he get fraud checked because the UFC is protecting him so much? No, but eventually Paddy's going to have to fight somebody really good, and he might just get chinned. And the UFC is going to despise that shit so much, but we know Paddy, he will at some point get fraud checked, but we kind of know that he already is a fraud, so he can't really be put too higher on this list. It really just is what it is when it comes to Paddy Pimblett. So I'm putting him at number 5 because he will get fraud checked. He is one of my more confident guys of getting fraud checked in the future. Now, moving on down to number 4, we have Shamil Gaziev. Now, he's fighting this weekend. He may or may not win against Jairzinho Rozenstruik. I'm picking Rozenstruik to win that matchup, but if he does win, he might get some more hype involved around his name. The reason why he's at number 4 is the fact that he is from that Eastern Hemisphere. He's Russian. He can grapple as well. And the biggest reason is because, guess what? He's a heavyweight. Heavyweight sucks. Heavyweight is one of the worst divisions in the UFC. It's a terrible division. And anybody who has some level of skill can probably make it far at heavyweight. So I do think if Shamil gets past Rozenstruik this weekend, he's going to get only more and more hype. But I don't think he's really that good. It seems like his takedown offense isn't really as special as we think it is. I believe he got dropped by Darko Stasic at one point in their fight, but he ended up coming back to KO him. But it just seems like Shamil Gaziev is not this elite level prospect, but then again, it is heavyweight and he will only get more hype. He's getting his first fight night main event after only having one fight in the UFC. The UFC wants to push this guy a little bit, and if that's the case, he might just end up being a fraud. So I put him at number 4 here because there's not much hype around him yet, but it's garnering, man. It's like a snowball. It might eventually get super huge. If he beats Rozenstruik, then beats another guy, we might just hear everybody talking about how this is the next guy to be champion at heavyweight. But I just don't see it. I don't believe it. I don't think he's really that good entirely. Like, can he prove me wrong? For sure, but I think somewhere down the line, he ends up getting fraud checked by a better heavyweight. There's somebody in the top 5 at heavyweight that will fraud check this man. Believe that. I'm telling you right now. Kindle MMA said it first. Now, moving on down to number 3, we have Beniot Saint-Denis. Now, he already has a loss in the UFC, but since that loss to Alexi dos Santos, I might have mispronounced that, but since that loss, he's kind of redeemed himself, and now he's fighting Dustin Poirier. He's a favorite in that matchup. He's getting a lot of hype right now. and he might just not beat Dustin Poirier. Let's remind ourselves, this is a 5-rounder, and when you watch back Beniot Saint-Denis versus Thiago Moises, you see him getting tagged. You see him getting a bit wild. And yes, he has some good KOs on his record. He has some good wins on his record overall. And the hype is, I think, somewhat well-deserved. But we have to remind ourselves that sometimes, man, you can take a jump up in the rankings too fast. And fighting Dustin Poirier in a 5-rounder is very dangerous for Beniot Saint-Denis. He might just get chin-checked by him, or just broken throughout 5 rounds. We can't say for sure that this guy is the next man up because he KO'd Matt Frevola with a head kick in the first round. Like, we don't really know how amazing Beniot Saint-Denis is in the top 5, top 10 at lightweight. And I understand he's a former military guy in France. He's based. He looks chatty as hell. Like, this guy has, I think, some well-warranted hype behind him. But let's not get it wrong. These dudes, like Beniot Saint-Denis, can go out there and just get absolutely mauled by Dustin Poirier. Like, we don't know how great he is just yet. And because he KO'd a few guys who were unranked at lightweight, doesn't mean he beats a top 5 guy like Dustin Poirier. Now, do I believe that Beniot Saint-Denis can beat Dustin Poirier? Yes, 100%. But will he? I don't know. And if he does lose to Dustin Poirier, guess what? That to me is a fraud check. Everybody's talking about how great this guy is, how he's the next man up at lightweight. And if he does lose to Poirier, that is a fraud check in my opinion. Now, I could be wrong. Like, if he does go out there and he just whoops on Poirier for 5 rounds or just maybe finishes him early, then you know what? I'm all wrong. It's not a fraud check, but this can come back to bite a lot of people in the ass if BSD loses. Now, let's move on down to number 2. At number 2, I have Muhammad Mokaev. Now, Mokaev is really good, but he's shown us in his most recent performances that maybe he's not as good as we think he really is. Now, he's getting wins by 3rd-round submission quite consistently now. Now, when you watch those first 2 rounds, there's problems for Muhammad Mokaev, and these are against guys at flyweight who aren't like really, like, they're good, obviously, but they're not that special. Now, Mokaev should be walking through these guys, but it's taking until the 3rd round for him to get a finish. He looks pretty iffy in the first 2 rounds, like when he fought Charles Johnson, I believe is his name. Like, that fight looked really, really iffy for him. When he fought Jafel Filho, he almost got subbed in the 3rd round. Like, there's some really iffy performances from Mokaev, but he's winning by 3rd-round submission. And a lot of people just see that 3rd-round submission and they just go all in on Mokaev, when in all reality, it's a less than stellar performance from him. And I don't know if he really beats anybody that's in the top 5, maybe top 3 at flyweight. It might take him up until that point for him to finally get fraud checked, but like, I really don't see Mokaev beating anybody who is really good at flyweight, like a Brandon Moreno, maybe even a Kai Kara-France. I definitely don't see him beating the champion Pantoja unless he improves, which he is young, by the way. I believe he's like, what, 25 now, maybe? I'm checking real quick. He's 23. He's 23 still. Like, Mokaev can improve, man. He's very, very young. So maybe Mokaev improves rapidly because he is so young, but if he does fight anybody who is really good at flyweight soon, I can see him losing. So you might have to do the O'Malley thing and pop for roids and then take 2 years off, then come back and be completely different and just smoke everybody to become champion. That's probably what he can do, but as of right now, if Mokaev fights anybody good soon, I see him losing. But who knows? Again, maybe he improves. Now, moving on to the number 1 spot. This guy, I think, if he does get fraud checked, the UFC will be hurting. Everybody who likes this guy will be hurting. There will be massive amounts of cope, a lot of I told you so's. It would be a complete volcano eruption if this guy loses in the UFC, and that is Bo Nickal. This guy has all the hype around him, man. And honestly, I like Bo Nickal. I see him being very good. I think he can go far in middleweight. But if he does lose, man, people are going to have a field day on this guy. The UFC is going to be pissed off because they really took their time with Bo Nickal. They're giving him matchups right now at the bottom of middleweight because they want him to build his resume first before they really push him. And if by some weird off chance he loses to Cody Brundage, bro, he's cooked. The UFC is cooked. Anybody who talked about Bo Nickal being good, they're cooked. I mean, there's going to be a ton of I told you so, some people who just doubted him because there's always some doubters in the UFC. But if Bo Nickal loses, man, it will be the biggest news, I think, for probably a couple weeks because UFC moves fast. But people are going to be on this man like butter on toast. I mean, Bo Nickal has been in interviews talking about how he has better wrestling than Khabib, that he believes that he can out-wrestle Chimaev and other UFC fighters who have good wrestling. Like, he has talked I wouldn't say a ton of shit, but he has been very confident in his ability. And if he loses to a scrub like Cody Brundage or anybody who is not ranked at middleweight, people are going to fucking scream fraud check from Mount Everest. People are going to say, why was this guy ever in the UFC? I know he was a good Division I wrestler, but that's really about it. He was, what, 3-0 when he got into the UFC. He beat a couple guys in the Contender Series. He shouldn't have been in the UFC at all. He should have had a few more regional fights before he ever got entered into the UFC. People are going to feast on Bo Nickal like no other if he manages to lose this, I think, within his next 3 fights. Now, personally, I don't really see Bo Nickal losing anytime soon because obviously he is young. He's new to MMA. He's fighting very low level at middleweights right now. But who knows, he may lose to an unranked middleweight because he's just not ready yet because he is so young in his MMA career. I firmly believe that Bo Nickal will be the UFC's biggest fraud check if he does lose within his next 2 or 3 fights. And if those fights are all against unranked fighters, holy shit, bro, we're going to see just a complete monsoon, a complete tsunami wave of hate against Bo Nickal. So Bo Nickal sent to number 1, and that concludes my top 5 list. I did have some honorable mentions here, but I didn't put them in the video. Like, I had Kyle Barajo as honorable mention, but he doesn't have too much hype around him. I also had Javid Basharat, but then again, these guys aren't really well-known names right now. Neither are they being pushed heavily by the UFC, so I didn't put them in the video. But let me know if you guys disagree with my list or you agree with my list. Let me know if you have any other fighters you thought should be in this list. But I'm out of here, guys. Like, subscribe, hit that bell icon for notifications. I'll see y'all later. Peace.